Welcome, everybody. I'm Kate Seelye, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and thank you for coming out to today's event, Building Moderate Syrian Rebel Forces, Prospects and Challenges. It's a topic that we here at MEI wanted to cover, given the calendar. The U.S. is on the eve of launching a congressionally authorized program to train a moderate Syrian rebel army in Turkey or Saudi Arabia. It remains to be seen. As Defense Secretary Hagel put it, we want to, quote, build an effective opposition force, not just a hit-and-run group of rebels. Those hit-and-run rebels have been covertly funded by the CIA as well as some of our allies in the region, and today they are facing many obstacles and challenges, including their possible route from Aleppo. Additionally, the U.S. air campaign against ISIS in Syria has done little to bolster the rebel cause. Instead, it has been seen on the ground in Syria as strengthening Assad and weakening the rebels. Training of this new force is supposed to begin in February or March. $500 million have been pledged to train some 5,000 rebels. The first objective of the group will be dealing with ISIS, not Assad, raising many questions about how to motivate this new group to do America's bidding when their own interests lie elsewhere. So we've assembled today an expert group to assess the current situation on the ground facing the rebels, as well as the future of a U.S.-backed, overtly U.S.-backed rebel army, and U.S. strategy in Syria in general. Each one of our speakers comes from a very different discipline, so they'll be bringing very unique perspectives to today's discussion. Roy Gutman is McClatchy's Middle East Bureau Chief, who's had much experience covering Syria, as well as the Middle East in general. He served for some time as Baghdad Bureau Chief, and he's won many awards for his journalism, including a Pulitzer for his coverage of the 1993 war in Bosnia-Herzegovina. To his left, Oubai Shahbandar currently serves as Strategic Communications Advisor to the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. That is the Syrian political opposition, and he's very familiar with the Syrian armed opposition. He also has had 7 years of experience working for the Department of Defense as a strategic analyst and foreign policy expert. General Paul Eaton, to his left, brings military experience to this panel, having served more than 30 years in the U.S. Army, including combat and post-combat assignments in Iraq, Bosnia, and Somalia. He was assigned to Iraq from 2003 to 2004 as commanding general of the Coalition Military Assistance Training Team, where he designed, manned, trained, and equipped the Iraqi armed forces. So he's going to have a lot to say today about what he learned from that experience and what can be applied to training a Syrian rebel force. And finally, we'll hear from Ambassador Robert Ford, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. He recently retired from a 30-year career with the Foreign Service after serving as U.S. ambassador to Syria from 2010 to 2014, and previously as ambassador to Algeria. He was awarded the Presidential Honor Award for his leadership of the American Embassy in Damascus at the outset of the Syrian Revolution. So thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining us today. We're going to start with some opening questions and statements, and then I really hope that this panel can become a very free-ranging conversation about U.S. strategy in Syria. So, Roy, I want to start with you. You've been spending a lot of time in Syria. You know the rebels very well. Could you just begin by kind of laying out the landscape for us? How are the rebels doing? What are the new pressures on them from ISIS, Nusra, the regime? How has the U.S. campaign has been affecting them or not? So why don't you just go ahead and lay it out, and I'm going to come sit next to you.
Thanks, Kate, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak here, and thanks for actually holding this discussion. I think there's not enough discussion in Washington about the subject. I think there are so many elements of it that desperately need to be aired, and I think this is a good opportunity to start. I may need more than 5 minutes, I have to tell you, if I'm going to go through what's happened in the last year. Things are really in flux. We at McClatchy did a story on Tuesday saying that the United States had suspended the salaries and arms for most of the pro-Western rebels fighting in the north of Syria. The commanders said the CIA had told them that the cutoff of aid was the U.S. response to the fact that they had losses to the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, the Jabhat al-Nusra, in November. The cutoff affects as many as 8,000 of the 10,000 CIA-vetted moderate forces who have been based in the Idlib and Hama provinces. Commanders predicted to us that this will only strengthen Jabhat al-Nusra, and it'll also strengthen the Islamic State, which is the ultra-extreme group, as you know, that controls at least 30%, 35% of Iraq, and as much, if not more, of Syria. The fighters on the ground, who are now paid $150 a month, are likely to join Nusra or to seek some other source of income, and they might even join the Islamic State. That was on Tuesday. Then we heard overnight that in the new omnibus spending bill that's been approved by Congress, they've cut out $300 million that had been set aside for, or had been earmarked for, covert aid for the forces on the ground. Congressman Connolly from Northern Virginia summed up, I think, the situation best at Wednesday's hearing of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He said part of the insurgency has collapsed in in Syria. It actually is losing ground catastrophically, almost to the point of extinction. Earlier, now that's today, so this is I'm sorry to say it's very up to date. Earlier this summer, I heard an estimate from the opposition defense minister that there were as many as 50,000 armed fighters going up against Assad, the Assad regime, and as many again who would join the battle if they had arms. Now I think the number is probably closer to 40,000, 10,000 in the north and about 30,000 in the south of Syria. In a month, it may be a total of just 30,000. To back up a little bit, a lot of Americans, and I have to just start with the assumption of many of the assumptions in this town. Indeed, a lot of well-known international journalists don't think there is such a thing as a Free Syrian Army. And of course, there isn't a Free Syrian Army as such. It is an umbrella group. It is a rubric for volunteer fighting groups all across Syria who took part in the response to the government's attacks on civilians who were protesting it and who wanted its removal, the regime's removal. The latest example of an international journalist, a really accomplished man, disputing if there is such a thing as a Free Syrian Army, is David Ignatius in this morning's Washington Post. And I had the feeling he was channeling General Allen, who is the administration's top appointee for coordinating the effort to fight ISIS. And David wrote, "There is no moderate opposition." Now, General Allen may have an excuse for saying that or for giving that view, because General Allen has yet to meet the military commanders of the rebel forces. It's a lame excuse, if that. But David is a journalist, and he can check his facts. He should know better. It is true, and I have to give the full disclaimer here, that reporters cannot cover the fighters in the field as we would like to, because, frankly, of the risks of kidnapping and the risks of landing in an ISIS lockup, and then, of course, we know what happens after that. But that doesn't mean they don't exist. The administration pretends that the rebel fighters, are a completely ineffective force. And that's a bizarre view, considering that the supplies that they've been sending them over the last months. But I cannot give you the ground truth on just how effective they are. What I can say is that they exist and that they've been defending any number of cities and districts in the north. A lot of people have been under their protection. And in the south, they've been making significant gains in their attempt to head towards Damascus. I can also say that the last year has been a dramatic one for them. 1 year ago, Islamist factions overran warehouses just inside the Syrian border that were full of Western and Arab-supplied arms. It was a humiliation for the Chief of Staff, General Salam Idris. And it was an all-time low for the rebel forces. Islamists were gaining on them, supply lines were threatened, all the territory they controlled was in jeopardy. And it wasn't just moderate Islamists who were after them. It was ISIS, after all, who, with the tacit support of the Assad regime, had taken as many as 80 towns and bases from the pro-Western rebels. But in January of this year, there was a dramatic reversal. With almost no support from the United States, rebel forces flushed the Islamic State out of roughly half of the towns and cities they had taken over in Idlib and Aleppo provinces. It was as heroic as it was an unexpected achievement. But there was no attempt by the United States, so far as I can detect, to build on this achievement. Instead, in reaction to General Idris's setback of the previous month of December of a year ago, the U.S. changed its method of supplying the forces. No longer would supplies and money go through the chief of staff of the Free Syrian Army, which was created by the Syrian opposition. And instead, under a CIA program, aid would go to individual commanders who were vetted by the CIA. They would bring their fighting plans to the CIA every month, and they would appeal for arms and money, and they would get something. And there was about a dozen commanders who got through this vetting process. Now, ISIS recovered from its setbacks. It has remarkable resilience. Its forces moved to the east of Syria, and then convoys of arms and fighters started to flow between Syria and Iraq in both directions. But the Free Syrian Army, which was willing and ready to fight them, was stripped of its ability actually to organize because there was no unified command structure, and they really could not carry on the offensive without a unified command structure. So ISIS might have been forced out of Syria, but it was the U.S. that let it grow. Since the fall of Mosul, and in fact, instead of coordinating with the commanders on the ground, the U.S. actually cut relations with them. Since the fall of Mosul, there has been almost no communication between the U.S. government and the responsible Syrian opposition figures. And the defense minister, the chief of staff, both professional military men, both defectors, both impressive men, couldn't get their phone calls returned. So in the midst of this world crisis, and it's a genuine crisis in Syria and Iraq over ISIS, there's no high level of coordination with the commanders on the ground in Syria. With the U.S. providing ever fewer weapons, commanders had to pull back their forces, even those fighting the Islamic State in the north of Aleppo. I'm going to quote you from a commander who was Kate's requested, just to give you the flavor of what they were saying. This is General Radoun, General Jamil Radoun, who told me, "I've got a little ammunition, but I don't have enough to continue our presence at the front line." So he said, as he was pulling forces out of the Aleppo area, where they were, among other things, fighting ISIS. He said to me, "Our problem with them," referring to the American-run dispensary for weapons and supplies. Our problem with them is that they walk like a turtle, but things on the ground go like a rabbit. Now, things have gotten a lot more complicated since then, and that was in about July. Rebel forces have gone from having one foe to three. They're fighting the Syrian government, they're fighting the Islamic State, and now they're fighting Al-Qaeda's affiliate, the Nusra Front. Instead of getting more assistance and guidance and encouragement, they're being cut off. How did it grow to three foes? Well, this is from my reporting. I was in Reyhanli, the town where the CIA and the other intelligence agencies have set up this arms and aid dispensing office, on September 23rd, when the United States began its airstrikes in Syria. Before bombing targets, the United States did not consult the Syrian commanders. It didn't even inform them that there was going to be bombing. And they bombed locations of the Nusra Front that were connected with the so-called Khorasan group, and which we can explain later. Immediately, commanders predicted to me that there would be a backlash. Fighters on the ground, their fighters on the ground, they're 10,000 plus, and maybe even more at that point, are volunteers. And they wouldn't understand, why is the United States bombing Nusra, whose forces have fought the regime, but spared the regime itself? and we can discuss the ins and outs of that as well. The fallout was completely negative. Nusra saw the moment. They attacked two of the pro-Western forces based in Idlib province last month, and their fighters of those two units predictably didn't want to fight Nusra, and Nusra took over their areas. The American response seems to be to punish the pro-Western forces for sustaining the setbacks that are indirectly a result of a U.S. decision. And now there's a real danger, very real danger, that Nusra will make common cause with the Islamic State. The two were at one point one up until April of last year, and reunite. In any case, all of northern Syria could come under the Islamic State or Nusra, and Nusra, as I mentioned earlier, is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. All this is happening as the administration ramps up its $500 million training program for 5,000 Syrian rebel troops. But I have to ask the question, does it make sense to spend $100,000 to train a single man, a single fighter, even as you're pulling the plug on very experienced forces on the ground in the country? Is the plan to take experienced fighters from the front, or men who have been sitting it out in refugee camps? If it's experienced fighters, well, other than being trained on specific weapons systems, I suspect they could train our forces, because they've been fighting for 3 years. And if the U.S. plans to take volunteers who have up until now been sitting it out, why would you want them? The program, from what I can see of it, lacks military logic as well as political sense. And no matter who is trained, after they've seen the U.S. effectively pulling the plug on fighters in the field, why would anybody trust a completely new program when the president is clearly not behind it? So these are the hallmarks of what I think is disaster. What I fear is disaster. But we have no idea, and I have to be the first to say that, of exactly what the administration has in mind. They won't explain themselves. And maybe if there's somebody from the administration in the audience who would like to defend what they're doing and what they're planning to do, please speak up. Thank you.
Wow, that is quite a grim assessment, Roy. Thank you very much. Just one follow-up question. What is the situation in Aleppo right now? How close are the moderate rebels to losing Aleppo before we go to Oubai?
Look, the best I can figure out is that they're holding their ground. They're losing manpower, though, because I think the demoralization of the opposition fighters is developing at a pace that we cannot quite even understand. But it's quite amazing that they're still holding it. Yeah, that's all I can say. It's quite amazing that they're still holding it.
Oubai, I'd like you to weigh in on a lot of what Roy has said. Is the situation as bad as Roy has painted it? What are your concerns about the situation on the ground? And also, the administration has been saying they don't have a reliable partner in the rebels, and that's why they're not, they've done so little to build a rebel force currently. What would your response be to that? What is the fix to this problem? And what are your priorities, the Syrian opposition's priorities going forward vis-a-vis this rebel situation?
Well, first, the situation on the ground is undoubtedly difficult, but difficult is not impossible. Right now, as Roy mentioned, there is an ongoing and heroic struggle by the moderate Free Syrian Army opposition forces in the city of Aleppo to defend it against both the encroachment of Lebanese Hezbollah, the Assad regime militias, and Iranian Revolutionary Guard forces that have been dispatched to northern Syria, specifically to encircle a city that used to be Syria's largest city, now with about a population of maybe 300,000 civilians in the city and in the countryside, that face potential encirclement and a starvation siege by the Assad regime and his Iranian-affiliated forces. But difficult is not impossible. While the Free Syrian Army is holding the Alamo, as it were, in Aleppo, they have not yet been overrun. So there is still a window of opportunity, and there are still potential partners on the ground that the United States and moderate Arab allies in the region can still support to hold the line not only against Daesh, but to hold the line against the foreign fighters that the Iranian regime has sent in and the Assad regime militias that are committing atrocities in northern Syria. So, specifically, despite in Aleppo, despite the lack of resources and despite, the recent reports that we've seen of international, support coming, being cut down to a trickle to northern Syria, the moderate rebels are remarkably resilient. Just last week, the Assad regime and Lebanese Hezbollah attempted to complete the encirclement of Aleppo city outside in the suburb of Handarat, and the rebels successfully pushed back against this offensive. So, despite their undersized resources that they have compared to what the Assad regime is receiving from its Iranian and Russian allies, the moderate rebels have had an outsized impact in their ability to hold their towns, to hold their villages, and defend the city of Aleppo from encirclement and starvation. Now, the Obama administration is absolutely correct when it says that strengthening the moderate opposition is a key component in the fight against ISIS. But at the same time, it is absolutely a strategic mistake to view the fight against Daesh in Iraq as being a wholly separate campaign than the fight against Daesh and Assad in Syria. The two are interwoven and are interlinked. Certainly, Daesh does not recognize the borders between Syria and Iraq, and the United States and its allies must likewise conduct their campaign against Daesh with a similar mindset, to view Iraq and Syria as the same area of operation. Now, why is this important from the perspective of the Syrian opposition? Because from the perspective of the Syrian opposition, the fight against Assad and the fight against Daesh, ISIS, is part of the same fight. It's the same campaign. In fact, you'll hear many Syrian opposition officials say that Assad and Daesh are two sides of the same coin. In fact, senior administration officials, even Secretary Kerry, themselves have said that Assad is a primary magnet for terrorism in Syria. So this begs the question on how U.S. policy will ultimately view the ongoing campaign against Daesh as being a component of the fight against Assad. Now, we are certainly not there yet. The administration has been very clear in recent statements that the priority is Iraq first. Fight Daesh in Iraq and try to contain it in Syria. But containment is not a strategy. In fact, containment has been attempted before in Syria and has not worked. You cannot contain a transnational terrorist organization that does not recognize borders. And you can't fight them in one area while allowing them safe haven in another area. I mean, it's essentially containing Daesh is akin to attempting to defeat them in Iraq, but to fight them to a draw in Syria. But you can't fight Daesh to a draw. There are no ties in this game. It's not soccer. You have to have a comprehensive, network-centric campaign that enables the Syrian opposition forces in Syria to take the fight against Daesh, and they're in the very heartland where Daesh operates in the eastern countryside in Syria and the northeastern part of the country, where, by the way, Syrian opposition forces are, alongside Syrian Kurdish forces, are the primary ground force in the fight against Daesh, not the Assad regime. So American policy has a decision to make on whether they will ultimately view the fight against Daesh in Iraq and against Syria as being part and parcel with empowering Syrian opposition forces to roll back the Assad regime and to ultimately shift the military balance on the ground against both Daesh and against Assad.
Right, they have not yet made that clear. For the moment, the focus is on Daesh only, and I think Robert will weigh in on some of the political calculations. But can you talk a little bit more about just some of the situation on the ground, and how has the ISIS campaign, the U.S.-led ISIS campaign, affected the rebel situation? I hear they're facing a lot of criticism. I read some quote, I have an American flag on my back, but I don't have any American guns in my hands. They're being very disadvantaged by our current campaign, are they not?
First, in terms of the situation on the ground, actually the Western media has really not done that great of a job in covering the significant advances that the Free Syrian Army is making in the southern front, specifically in the provinces of Dara and Quneitra. A Free Syrian Army commander that I spoke with recently, in fact, told me we are close to opening the doors to Damascus. The Free Syrian Army in the south, by the way, is extremely effective. They are led by a very capable and charismatic leader by the name of Abu Usama al-Jolani, who is secular, who has the trust of his commanders on the ground and the support of the people that he is attempting to liberate. Now, why is this important? It's important because this is what's happening on the Syrian-Jordanian border, and what's happening in the province of Dara and in the countryside of Damascus is a clear indication that the rebels are not done. They are not through, and they are fighting, and that there is support that is being provided by the international allies that is going to help the Free Syrian Army in their campaign to defeat the Assad regime. So there is hope. There are commanders like Abu Usama al-Jolani in the south who are secular, who the United States has worked with, and ultimately are the greatest counterweight to ISIS and Nusra. Now, in the north, like I said, it's very difficult. In the province of Idlib that Roy mentioned, Nusra, Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, launched a campaign specifically targeting the Free Syrian Army. Now, you have really in the north two main brigades that the international community can really support, who are basically holding the line against both Nusra and against ISIS, the Hazm movement and the Syrian Revolutionaries Front, though the latter is mainly active in the south. But so it goes back to that there are options that American policymakers can work with. Now, that window is shrinking, but they're still there, and they're still viable, and they are looking for American leadership.
All right. Well, that sounds like a good note on which to turn to General Eaton. General Eaton, let's talk a little bit about your reading. I mean, as a military man, can you explain, help us understand why we've sort of funded this rebel force only to not support it at this critical time? Can you explain this, the impact of such a half-hearted policy?
The United States hasn't developed a strategy for the region that makes sense to the United States, to the citizens of the United States. And we've got an incoherent response to any number of stimuli that have happened to us out there. And nations operate on vital interests and conditional interests. Vital is generally accepted as a term that's existential to the nation. We have very few vital national interests. We have conditional interests throughout the planet, and but the President of the United States has not decided what level of support he's going to dedicate here. He just has not made the decision. We've got a 30-nation coalition that he is trying to cobble together, and we've got two primary camps. One is get rid of Assad, and one as a main effort, and the other is get rid of ISIS as a main effort. The president has demonstrated and dedicated a fair amount of time to ISIS. And he is going after the Islamic State as a main effort, and everything else is a supporting effort. You resource your main effort to effect, and you do what you can on the supporting effort. That's my read of what the president has elected to do. And Roy mentioned that the president has not figured out how he wants to support the Free Syrian Army and the moderates in Syria. So if that's the case, why did we get involved at first, other than a very small effort sponsored by the CIA and supporters in the region to develop Free Syrian Army fighters. We got in because ISIS was approaching the gates of Erbil. Not because we had the emotional assault of watching Americans beheaded, but it was an American interest to retain the territorial integrity of the 4 provinces in the north of Iraq. We had this emotional bond with the Kurds, and as ISIS approached the gates of Erbil, that's when we started seeing airstrikes. So we've now moved off of, we're going to have a low-level support to develop Free Syrian Army in Syria, to collapse of the Iraqi army, the assault on the northern provinces, and a president who has moved from low-level support to identifying ISIS as his main effort. So, what should the United States do, which is essentially what we're talking about here, and for the region? And it's clearly, obviously, as we've heard, it is not just about Syria. It's not just about Iraq. It is, in fact, about countries that have vital national interests in the outcome of the ISIS perimeter that is astride Iraq and Syria, and it's also about Mr. Assad. This is an existential issue for the Alawites. This is an existential issue for President Assad. That means he is unrestrained. When it's vital, when it's existential, there are no restraints. For us, it's not vital. There are restraints. So, what is the art of the possible to deal with a problem that is far bigger than what's going on in Syria? The development of the coalition is going to be work over time. So, as the planners are going after this, they are going after the art of the possible. That is, you can stabilize what you can. You contain what you wish, and you will go after the ultimate restoration of the state of Syria and the state of Iraq. But it's not going to be a quick affair. We discuss it's not a joke, but good, fast, and cheap. You get 2 out of 3. If you want it good, and if you want it fast, it's going to be very expensive. And the president has determined that he is not going to dedicate extraordinary resources to effect an outcome. It's also far bigger than just a military problem. When we talk about clear, hold, build, our courageous Syrians in the Free Syrian Army are able to clear, but they have been unable to hold, and they have been unable to build. It's far bigger than just a military issue. So what the United States is struggling to work through right now is, what are they willing, what are we willing to dedicate to an outcome? And we have apparently decided that it's not going to be a fast outcome. It's going to be good, it's going to be cheap, and it's going to take a long time.
All right, well, I'll jump in there. Since we have a military man with us, let's talk about this a cheap, slow process that we're undertaking, $500 million on 5,000 new rebel forces. What is it going to take for this to succeed? What are the challenges that it faces? Maybe you could unpack this upcoming force, and some of the challenges, some of the issues, some of the red flags. We've been reading about the psychological vetting that's going to have to take place. Is this a serious effort?
Kate, I have a lot of scar tissue on developing the Iraqi armed forces. And we went in there in 2003 with intent to create a national institution of the Iraqi army, nationally recruited, locally employed. The intent was to employ the Iraqi army against enemies from without, while police forces will do what police forces do for internal security. And we discovered in April of 2004, when my 2nd Battalion essentially collapsed as we asked it to go into provide the outer perimeter for Fallujah, we had to reorient the development of the Iraqi security forces and make it a regionally or locally recruited, locally employed in the counterinsurgents effort. When we talk about the development of this force that's going to start in March with 1 year to do it, it takes about 8 weeks to create a basically trained soldier. It takes a very long time to create conventional units that can operate at the battalion, brigade, and division level. So I think a 1 year plan is very hopeful, and it's also going to require a substantial effort to create not just the individual soldiers, but to take the leadership of the Free Syrian Army and to develop them in ways that they may not be developed to do right now. Some have the institutional background to operate at the battalion, brigade, division level, but it's one thing to have individuals with that knowledge. It's another thing to create conventional forces that can clear terrain, hold terrain, and then turn it over to established political entities that can build. And that was very difficult in Iraq with 160,000 U.S. troops and coalition forces there. So we're talking a significant effort. It's one thing to conduct a raid, but after you conduct the raid, seize the town, then this hold is difficult to achieve. ISIS and al-Nusra have demonstrated that they can achieve mass very quickly. The gift of communications will allow units to disperse and make themselves a very small target until they need to achieve mass to achieve an outcome, and then communications can bring them together very, very quickly to achieve a mass attack, and that's what we saw ISIS do in Mosul, and then to disperse. So what used to be difficult for insurgents to do is now a lot easier for them to do, to not be a target, and then be a target but so fleetingly that before a conventional force can kill you, you disperse again to avoid being targeted. So this business of building a force that can get after this kind of insurgent is no small affair. It's certainly not a short-term affair.
So some doubts expressed there about the viability of facing ISIS in the near term, at least. Robert, you've been calling for a while for better funding of the moderate rebel forces in Syria. Is what we're now talking about doing the right response? Is it the right response but too late? Is it the wrong response? Give us your reaction to what's going on and what you think is needed now.
Couple of things I'd say. First, I think everyone in the United States needs to understand that this fight against the Islamic State is a two-front war. There's a Western front and there's an Eastern front, but it's one single conflict. The border no longer really exists. So there's a Western front in Syria and there's an Eastern front in Iraq. But just like in other wars that have multiple fronts, forces move back and forth. That's what Oubai was saying, and I can't agree with that strongly enough. I think it's important to remember that when the Islamic State started its blitzkrieg into Mosul and then down the Tigris Valley, it came out of Syria. But it originally came into Syria from Iraq years ago. So it's one single war with multiple fronts. The administration's priority is in the east, in Iraq. There are more tools to work with there. That makes sense to me. There is a government. It's not perfect government, but it's actually a better government than it was a few months ago. The prime minister in Iraq, I think, Haider al-Abadi, is a very good guy. He's a very honorable man, and he is making efforts to reach out to other communities, Kurds and Sunni Arabs, and he's making some progress. And they really have pushed the Islamic State on the defensive in a lot of places in Iraq. But that doesn't mean that you can just kind of ignore the Western Front and win in the East. As I mentioned, the strategic depth issue that the Islamic State enjoys in Syria will undermine any effort we have of stabilizing Iraq. I met a group of Iraqis just this past weekend in Europe from Western Iraq, and they underlined that point, that they will be vulnerable constantly to incursions from the Islamic State from Syria. They're worried about that. So what do you do then about the Islamic State in Syria? Well, there are some people in this city, in Washington, who have suggested that we work with Bashar al-Assad. I just would say, please read an analysis by an extremely good analyst that works for the Carnegie Endowment named Yazid Sayegh. He lives in Beirut, but he writes with Carnegie, and he just posted a very good assessment of the weaknesses that are growing inside the Assad regime, both economically and politically. The Assad regime has never been able to retake the suburbs of Damascus, so I don't really know how it's going to go 600 miles to the east and get out to the Iraqi border unless it takes with it to spearhead its forces Lebanese Hezbollah and Iranian Revolutionary Guards, because the places where the Syrian regime has made advances, it has those forces. But this is a two-front war, and what happens in the east, if those Iranian and Hezbollah forces go to the east, is the Sunnis in Iraq will then feel they're being surrounded by the Iranians, the original nature of the problem in Iraq, and they will, in turn, go join the Islamic State, which was the point, again, that the Iraqi Sunnis I just met this past weekend in separate conversations emphasized to me, so that what happens in Syria has both tactical as well as strategic implications for the Eastern Front in Syria. So then who's going to deal with the Islamic State? And to me, there's just this group of moderates that we've been talking about, and I think the American policy has really become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're divided and they're weak, and therefore we shouldn't really bank on them and we shouldn't give them too much support because they're divided and they're weak. And guess what? Then they're even more divided and they're even weaker. The very sort of dynamic that Roy was just discussing. I have to tell this audience, I am not sure it's not too late, especially in the north. The paucity of support for people that are trying to defend Aleppo is just amazing to me. At the very time American forces are bombing Islamic State positions in Deir ez-Zor, the one place in Syria where the Islamic State is fighting the Bashar al-Assad regime, we have studiously avoided hitting any Islamic State units that are fighting the moderates that we're also trying to help. I do not understand the target selection. It makes no sense to me. And it has, in addition, a very negative political impact that Roy and Oubai talked about. We've got the American flag on our backs, but we're actually getting creamed by people who think we're American agents. So this is really it's a policy that it really is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the end result of this, where we are going, if we don't change and we don't get our allies to work with us, we're going to have a situation on the Western Front where you will have Bashar al-Assad and jihadis and nobody else. And I really don't envy the next president if he has to choose between dealing with the Bashar al-Assad regime, which is weakening, or the jihadis, how do you make that choice? How do you make that choice? So, but that's where we're going. And unless we figure out a way quickly to build up moderates, I don't see any way around that.
But isn't that what we're stating that we're going to be doing?
Well, yeah, we're stating a lot of things. We also state that we want a political solution in Syria, but we don't do any of the things necessary to get to a political solution. I haven't met anyone who thinks we don't need to change the balance on the ground a little bit and put more pressure on the regime to get to a negotiation, but we don't do that either. So I distinguish between what we say we want to do and what we are doing, Kate.
Right, and you said you can't understand the policy, nor can many of us here in the room. We were hoping you could shed some light on why it is so confused.
So I understand what they're trying to do, but it's not working. And I have yet to meet a single member of the armed opposition that says that they would join American-financed and backed units that fight only the Islamic State. I think we might very well arm and train some people, but I will be very surprised if they only fight the Islamic State. And then we will feel betrayed because they went and fought Bashar al-Assad and the Islamic State. They're already telling us that's what they would do.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Let's go through a second round, talk a little bit about some of the projects on the ground. Staffan de Mistura, the UN Syria envoy, is proposing a freeze, a cessation of fighting between the regime and rebel forces in Aleppo. He's been holding discussions with rebel groups to try to get them to sign on. Winter is coming. The humanitarian situation is very bleak. Roy, what's your reaction to this freeze proposal, its viability, and how it would affect or impact the rebels in the north in Aleppo? And please feel free to comment on anything else you've heard in the last 20 minutes.
Well, obviously, the people of Aleppo need to survive, and anything to stop the barrel bombing probably would be welcomed by them. But there are many hooks when you create a ceasefire with the Assad regime, and the experience of other towns is that it leads to the government takeover. So I think there's a lot of suspicion that's going to happen. That's going to be accompany any effort by de Mistura. But the more profound reason for doubts about his whole enterprise is that, and I have to give an analogy, if I can, from Afghanistan. I did a book about Afghanistan in the 1990s, and I studied what went wrong. What were the big mistakes of U.S. policy that led, in a certain sense, to 9/11? And one of the mistakes, I've now sort of isolated about 10 major factors. One of the major mistakes was when the United States turns diplomacy over to the United Nations, what we're basically doing is throwing up our hands. Unless the U.S. backs that diplomacy with the threat of the use of force. Because diplomacy simply in a vacuum is not going to achieve anything. Nobody's going to take it very seriously. In the case of Syria, we've gone now through three really of the top people in the UN, Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi, and now we have de Mistura. And Lakhdar Brahimi, interestingly enough, was also the special envoy in Afghanistan, and he quit. And he was the special envoy in Syria, and he quit. And I think we have to take these guys seriously when they step down. The really best we have in the whole international community, because they have no tools to work with. So I think they're out there sort of spinning ideas and doing their damnedest to come up with good plans. But there's no way anything's going to work unless there's the threat of the use of force. And in the case of Aleppo, in particular, you have a town where on one recent weekend, it was about a month ago, I think, there were 200 air sorties against the town. And every air sortie is, in fact, in this case, these are helicopter sorties where they drop barrel bombs on the town. I don't know the exact number, but it was over 200, maybe as many as 400 barrel bombs in 2 days. Now, every one of those barrel bombs is actually a criminal act because they are indiscriminate. They cannot be targeted. They just push them off of the chopper. And there actually is a remedy for them. The remedy is rather simple, and the remedy is air defense. The U.S. has been unwilling to provide air defense, so Aleppo is just totally vulnerable as a result of this lack of air defense. And the people living there, the 300,000 that Oubai was mentioning, are just subject to being victims anytime. So if you want to add a little bit of muscle to the equation and give Mr. de Mistura his chance, you really have to add an element of coercion or the threat of coercion, and there's none. So I don't see how that can work.
Well, General Eaton, what do you think about a no-fly zone, and is this part of the answer?
Well, in this case, a no-fly zone would fall directly into a responsibility to protect first, and an effort to aid and abet combat operations on the ground, but R2P first, because that's really what a no-fly zone would do. That's what we did for the north of Iraq with Saddam for over a decade. We gave Saddam a very narrow lane to operate aircraft within, and the effort to protect the Shia in the south. A fairly inexpensive solution in the grand scale. It's something that the Air Force knows how to do very well. It would be easier today because of drones. We would be able to have sortie packages up and drones monitoring. Helicopters are a little bit tougher, but with drones to monitor helicopter location and helicopter departure, you could do this without expending a prodigious amount of effort. So far, Assad has not used his air defense system against U.S. air assets. So far, he's reported to have a sophisticated integrated air defense system that will operate at low, medium, and high altitude. He's got the 300 system that the Russians sold him. I hear reports maybe components of the next best system that the Russians have, the S-400, but I don't know that has been integrated. But then you contend with the Russians, and then you contend with the Iranians as you go after that. So it's not a clean outcome, because once embarked upon, it's going to be interesting to see how it goes.
But it would enhance U.S. goals to defeat ISIS. You have a place for rebels to regroup, to train. It places more pressure on Assad. I mean, there are a lot of advantages. Maybe you could elaborate more on why we are so reluctant to do what you just mentioned we could do.
I believe our reluctance is directly related to Assad and Assad's do no harm to U.S. forces and to the Russians to not deliver the next best system for air defense, either to Assad or the S-400 or 300 going to the Iranians. I mean, it's all Kissinger's, everything links to another. And so the reluctance, what would the Russians do? What would the Iranians do? Were we to direct attack Assad's assets, and then what would he do? So it's, I got to believe that the administration is going through that calculus to weigh the odds on cost benefit to a no-fly zone over Syria.
Robert, you're nodding your head. Do you want to weigh in?
I think what Paul mentioned is exactly right, and those are big questions. I mean, what the Russians would do in terms of provision of additional air defense systems, and perhaps what they would give to the Iranians. There's a lot of discussion in the punditry here in Washington about a no-fly zone, but I think if we were to move in that direction, and I'm not sure it's the best idea, but if we were, I do know we had better demand some pretty strict conditions from our friends. From our friends in the Syrian opposition, we should not try to do a no-fly zone until they themselves have a well-developed political approach to the Assad regime to go back to negotiations, and that includes reaching out to different elements of communities that still support the Assad regime. Let's face it. I mean, the reason he's there is he's got some support. The Syrian opposition needs to be reaching out to those supporters and saying, look, Assad, Islamic State, there has to be a third way. Join us in trying to develop that third way. That has to be a condition for a no-fly zone. With our friends in the region, the other governments, I think we also have to demand some conditionality if we were to go down that path. The first is I worry very much that some countries would actually eject refugees out of their countries and put them into this no-fly zone or this buffer area. I worry a great deal about that. The refugees are causing huge strains in countries like Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, but they should not take advantage of a no-fly zone or a safe zone to eject refugees into it and say, not our problem. So commitments on that. Second, we've talked a lot about the divisions inside the armed moderate opposition. Let's be honest. The reason that it's so divided is because the donors who help it are divided. Everybody has their own little favorite client groups that they help. We don't like Islamists, so we don't help them. But other countries do. The groups need to be united under a single Syrian command, and all of the assistance, let me underline this, all of the assistance needs to go through that command. Let me give you an example. I was talking to the French ambassador about this a couple months ago. In World War II, when de Gaulle was trying to build a free French army, the British and the Americans didn't deal with the individual free French battalions and just get them stuff in without going back to de Gaulle. De Gaulle wouldn't have put up for it. They insisted on a single channel so that de Gaulle had leverage over those French fighters. We need to do something like that in Syria. It doesn't mean that the Syrians pick anybody and we go along with it. We'd obviously have to agree. But all of the countries, the Saudis, the Turks, the Qataris, the Americans, the French, all of those that are providing help need to run it through a single unified command. And if they don't want to do it, I don't think a no-fly zone is ever going to help anyway.
But Robert, isn't that what we're trying to do with the new forces in Turkey?
I have not heard that at all.
I mean, Ken Pollock has written a long paper about, this vanguard Syrian army.
If that's what the administration is doing, they're not making it public to the other allies. So, and then I have a last conditionality, which is, again, from the foreign states. They, too, must support and push Syrian armed fighters to support a political solution. They have to. Otherwise, again, the no-fly zone just goes out there. We had a no-fly zone for 12 years in Iraq. And actually, it only ended when American forces went into Baghdad and pulled Saddam's statue down at Firdous Square. So how long are we going to have a no-fly zone in Syria? We're going to have it until there's a solution. So part of setting it up would require conditionality that moves us towards that solution. Otherwise, I think it's just an open-ended commitment with the drawbacks that Paul mentioned.
All right, Roy, quickly, and then Oubai needs to respond to Robert's challenge.
Just that one of the problems with the no-fly zone, one of the advantages of a no-fly zone is that it would allow the civilian leadership of the opposition a place to set up their shop inside the country. And it's absolutely essential that they submit themselves to the test of being inside the country and administering there. And then they might be able to sort out just who's a real leader and who can really manage it. But one of the real problems of setting up a no-fly zone is you need some force or other that's willing to defend it. And I don't think you can't just do it from the air. You also need a ground force. And the problem now with the near collapse of the forces in the north, or the approaching collapse as it appears right now, is that force might have been the force, but I don't know how it's going to exist. The alternative would be an outside force, and the obvious candidate would be Turkey, which has been advocating the no-fly zone. In fact, President Erdogan has himself laid out almost on a map where he thinks it should be. And he's talking about the 36th parallel, which includes, north of it is Aleppo. So, it would be a very, very interesting thing. It goes all the way to Raqqa, and it's a huge amount of territory, but it needs to be defended. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, and I've done my due diligence in trying to get to the Turkish government to ask them to explain exactly where they would fit into this equation, they don't see themselves on the ground. The Turkish public does not support Turkish forces going out of country. They do not support certainly the loss, and they don't want to see their young men, their boys, their conscripts die in Syria. They've been through that episode with the Ottoman Empire. They don't really intend to have to return. So without a ground force, I don't know how you go forward.
And yet they've been screaming for one. And just to wrap up this subject before we go into Oubai, I mean, Robert, from what I've been reading from Erdogan, it sounds like he's making a no-fly. It sounds like he's making the training of the next Syrian rebel force conditional upon our implementing a no-fly zone. Don't we want to make the Turks happy? They're pretty critical to this solution going forward.
I don't see how we're going to have success against the Islamic State in Syria without Turkish support, because Turkey has the longest land border where the Islamic State is located. Their cooperation is essential, let's be honest. A lot of the fighters for the Islamic State got into Syria and Iraq through Turkey. So the Turkish cooperation is absolutely essential. I have seen what Erdogan has said publicly, and my sense is that the administration is trying to negotiate with the Turks. It goes back, I think, on the Turkish side to what are you going to do about Bashar al-Assad, since everyone agrees he is a magnet that is attracting jihadi recruits to come fight for the Islamic State. And so the Turks want to deal with both problems, not just one being a priority and the other being a kind of a hold the fort. I think the Turks want a more proactive policy, and this is, I think, a subject of discussion now between the two governments.
Thank you. Oubai, I know you want to respond to Robert's challenge that the political opposition needs a better developed response in order to sort of earn a no-fly zone.
Well, I mean, first of all, going back to the issue of a freeze in Aleppo, let's be very clear. There is no moral equivalency between both sides. Syrian opposition anti-Assad forces are not dropping 500 and 1,000-pound bombs on apartment blocks, on houses and schools in Aleppo and in southern Syria. It's very, very clear that the Assad regime maintains overwhelming advantage in terms of firepower and in terms of air assets. So when we talk about finding a comprehensive political solution, we have to keep in mind that there is one side and one side only in this conflict that is actively going out of its way to bombard civilians. They're even launching barrel bomb attacks against internally displaced camps, refugee camps in Syria. That has happened on multiple occasions. So there is not only a military strategy here being employed by the Assad regime, but there's also an extermination strategy being employed by the Assad regime that we have to keep in mind when we discuss what the United States should do in Syria. A no-fly zone or an air exclusion zone is, in my view, militarily viable, it is morally justifiable, and it is strategically prudent. You need to shift the balance on the ground. The Assad regime is not going to voluntarily stop dropping 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs on civilians, on apartment blocks, and on refugee camps. They just are not. There has to be a deterrence, and you can't reach a conducive environment for political negotiations and for a political solution if the Assad regime believes that he can fight his way to victory, or if the Assad regime and his affiliated Iranian forces believe they can exterminate their way to victory. They are employing a scorched earth policy. And secondly, you also have to view an air exclusion or a limited no-fly zone within the overall prism of empowering local communities in Syria Syria to fight back Daesh. It is very difficult to convince local Syrian communities in northern and eastern Syria today, who, by the way, are at the forefront of fighting Daesh. It's very difficult to convince them that the international anti-Daesh coalition and that the United States has their best interests in mind when coalition aircraft are operating a few kilometers away from where the Assad regime's barrel bombs are being launched against civilians. So the United States is in a position where it is losing hearts and minds of the very people that it needs to spearhead the fight against Daesh in northern and eastern Syria. In areas where Daesh could potentially be cut off at the knees, the United States is and its current policy is in danger of losing the support that it could otherwise garner from local Syrian communities if there is not a dedicated effort to re-look at the strategic value and the moral imperative of establishing a no-fly zone in the north. Now, we have heard responses from administration officials that a no-fly zone would be resource intensive. But the reality is that the Assad regime's integrated air defense is completely hollowed out. They have legacy SA-2 systems in the north. They don't have all the components for the S-300s that the Russians have been providing them because the Israeli Air Force has taken a significant portion of those out. So the Assad regime has already demonstrated that it does not even have the capability of defending high-valued regime military assets in its own capital. So why would we be afraid that the Assad regime would have not only the capability but even the desire to go after coalition aircraft in northern Syria if a limited no-fly zone was established? So you have the military, you have a military viable solution, and you also have a moral imperative at the same time. And this goes back to linking the objective of fighting ISIS with gaining local Syrian support to enable the fight against ISIS on both the Syrian and the Iraqi front.
Robert, U.S. is losing hearts and minds in Syria, just to get back to what Oubai said, because we're getting to the end of our round of questions before we go to the audience. What is the right approach to Syria right now, given what we're facing? What would you advise the Obama administration or the next administration to do? They're sequencing this fight, ISIS first, maybe Assad next. What would you propose if that's not the correct way to go about this?
I understand the prioritization of Iraq, but there's a lot to be done in Syria too. We have talked about the gains that the moderate armed fighters have made in the south. They need to get much more support than they're getting. I just talked to one of their representatives in the last day or two, and he said they get 15 to 20% of what they need. They're scrounging for everything else. I just can't emphasize enough to people that an unstable, unreliable logistics train accents divisions and slows progress in a war of attrition. And the purpose of the war of attrition that the opposition is fighting is not to have a military victory parade in downtown Damascus. It's to get the regime back to a negotiating table. So help the people in the south that are making gains. I think there needs to be a very hard-headed assessment about what is salvageable in the north. I understand they've cut support. Roy was talking about that. Does that fit with a strategy of compelling the regime over time to go back to a negotiating table or not? And if it doesn't fit with that broad policy objective, then turn that tap back on. So I want them to think about where they're trying to go and then adjust the tactics so that it makes sense with the strategy. I think it's imperative that we have discussions with the other donors about setting up and supporting a single unified command. And if the other allies providing support to the moderate opposition won't play that game, then we need to leave the game. and there's really nothing we can do. So we're going to have a really hard-headed talk with the other countries that are supporting the Syrian opposition. I personally think the Demastura initiative for a freeze is very laudable, trying to get aid into people as the winter approaches. But I think we will need to have a serious discussion with our Russian friends about an enforcement mechanism. There have been over 3 dozen ceasefires attempted, and only one has endured any length of time. The rest, according to 2 different independent studies, one by a group out of London and one by a group out of Turkey, concluded that regime forces in general violated the terms and shut off food supplies and started fighting again. So we need an enforcement mechanism for Demastura's freeze plan to work, but you can't have an enforcement mechanism if the Security Council is constantly blocked by Russian vetoes.
Thank you. General Eaton, final thoughts, some takeaways from your experience in Iraq in terms of what we're going to need to do on the ground in Syria, training forces to achieve some of the goals that Robert spelled out.
When I mentioned earlier about main effort working against ISIS, that doesn't mean the supporting effort gets nothing. And what the ambassador was just talking about, we have to resource the man, train, equip mission appropriately. It was not resourced appropriately in Iraq until 4 years into the efforts to develop. You know, I struggle. My biggest problem in developing the Iraqi armed forces was the Pentagon. That was my load to bear, to convince them that what we're doing here is important. And if the president is going to determine that he has got to solve a regional problem, part of the problem is developing somebody else's boots on the ground, which is the Free Syrian Army in this case, and to properly resource the man, train, equip mission so that that we do not have a comment, you know, I think it's great, an American flag on my back and no rifle in my hands. So that's the effort. He's got to resource it properly, and I think that we could find very, very friendly adjacent nations to help us in that regard.
Okay, let's move to questions. I'm going to take 3, 4 at a time and sprinkle them among the table. We'll begin. Harlan, you had your hand up. And if you could please identify yourself. Don't answer his question. As I said, I'll take a few more and then we'll get to them, please. There's a microphone coming.
I'm Harlan Ullman. I'd like to thank the panel. Roy Gutman's comments were reminiscent of 50 years ago or so with Vietnam, and the parallel is really quite striking. We've described how difficult and dangerous the situation is, but we really haven't come up with any prescriptions. And so I wonder what the panel would say about how do you engage, if at all, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, the Saudis, the Turks, and other countries which have really vital interests involved. And what can we do in that regard, or is that going to be as hopeless as the situation has already been discussed?
In the middle, he has his...
Thank you. Joseph Bahoud from Carnegie. In fact, 2 questions. One is something which is beginning to be more and more difficult to put in a box, which is Jabhat al-Nusra, in fact, in this landscape. We are in a situation where we have a kind of Russian dolls mechanism. I mean, in the beginning, it was a campaign anti-ISIS. Then the US began to strike Nusra because it used to fight the regime with the rebels, was considered more legitimate in the rebellion, but now it is criminalized. Lately, Secretary Kerry even mentioned Ahrar al-Sham as a target and as let's say, a criminalized faction. But at the same time, we know that part of Ahrar al-Sham is part of the rebellion on which we are betting, and Ahrar al-Sham lately has become much more Jabhat al-Nusra led. So it's very complicated. So where do we draw the line when we talk about moderate rebels, and where do we put Jabhat al-Nusra exactly in the future strategy? I know that this is a difficult question within the Syrian, let's say, opposition. The second question, very quickly, and maybe Oubai here can answer. The Supreme Military Council has elected 2 days ago a new chief, Abdel Karim Ahmad, I think. Can you say a little bit about him? And because we're getting lost in the reshuffling of the SMC lately. Several people has been elected and then dismissed and etc., which raises also the question of the articulation between the former professional military from the former Syrian army who defected and the rebellion. Why aren't these people more effectively employed in building a kind of unified professional future army for the future Syria, if one day we have a future Syria? Thank you.
Okay, and just pass the microphone to the man next to him. Yeah, I'll get you out.
Yeah, thanks. John Anderson, independent analyst. Question on financing Islamic State and other groups, and including ultimately possibly, quote, moderates opposition to the Assad regime. We had some fun, I guess it was in August, when Vice President Biden, for 15 or 20 minutes, kind of got off the reservation and talked about jihadist radicals being funded out of Turkey, Qatar, and the Gulf capitals. And that quieted down pretty fast. In fact, the pundit and analysis industry has not really wanted to pick this up full square, but to the extent there's been commentary, it has often tended to believe that, well, perhaps state funding is less important now when there's still a factor of individual finance. We know it's a region which not only are there, a million or so millionaires, there are some people that even have real money.
Could you please get to the question? Yeah.
Question is, can we in fact get a lid on this? Is there a possibility of a single unified command, unless our, quote, allies and others do in fact manage to control individual sources of funding, not just for Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, but a flurry of groups, and of course even some that may come under the FSI or, quote, moderate umbrellas. Can shaky monarchies actually do this? And what are our chances in that mix that has also been described by others? And thank you.
Great. Okay, we've got 4 questions. Maybe, Robert, you want to take the question about how to, engage with Russia, the Iranians, Hezbollah, who also have very vital interests in the region in trying to get to a solution, and then, yeah.
Secretary Kerry worked really hard on all of these accounts before the Geneva talks of January and February this year. He pushed it really hard. The key is really Russia and Iran, because they are the ones that are keeping the Assad regime in existence. I mentioned the analysis from Yazid Sayegh from Carnegie that came out yesterday, and I do recommend that analysis to everyone with an interest in Syria. The regime really must have support. I think perhaps even now Iran is more important than Russia, although Russia provides cover in the Security Council. But I do not sense that the Russians are going to move very much in terms of compelling a negotiation for a government in Syria that could mobilize most Syrians against the Islamic State, the way we're trying to get the new government in Iraq to mobilize most Iraqis, Sunnis and Kurds and Shia in Iraq against the Islamic State. If we could get that kind of a government in Syria, I think then there would be a clearer path forward on what to do on the Western Front with this new government. But the Russians, frankly, didn't lift a finger in January and February in Geneva, which is one of the reasons the talks collapsed. It's probably worth people here knowing the Syrian opposition in February in Geneva put a formal written proposal on the table, gave it to the United Nations saying, we're prepared to negotiate a new government, and we do not have as a precondition that Assad step down. We're even willing to negotiate that. So the regime refused, and the starting point then with the conversation with the Russians has to be, okay, we need an enforcement mechanism for Stefan de Misture's freeze plan to work. That's one topic. And then the second topic is, how do we get back to a negotiation, but a serious negotiation, which involves some changes in Damascus?
But the Russians have been running around lately working on a new peace plan. Do you know anything about that?
Only what I've seen in the media, and both sides are getting tired. As I mentioned, the regime is getting tired and the opposition is very tired. That's a positive sign in terms of getting towards a negotiation. But whether or not this Russian initiative will produce enough of a change in Damascus that the people fighting the regime in Damascus would accept to stand down is a big question. I think it's safe to say that the jihadis, the Islamic State, and this al-Qaeda faction, Nusra, I think they will never accept any agreement worked out in Russia. So they're going to keep fighting no matter what. Then you would have a new government. Would that new government be able to mobilize enough of the remaining Syrians to fight those jihadis? That's a question. And I don't think the Russians fully understand that there has to be a political angle as well as a security angle. It appears to me that the Russians, by constantly pumping armaments into the Assad war machine, are still thinking in terms of a security solution.
Both Roy and Oubai want to respond. Roy, why don't you start?
Well, coming back to that question, it seems to me the key player here is Iran. Iran has leverage in Damascus. Iran is probably what's keeping the regime afloat. It's not just the Hezbollah fighters that Iran is supporting and helping direct, but it is the flow of logistics and arms from Iran, funds, their commanders in the field, their advice and their international support, which is so crucial. And here the problem, it seems to me, is that the administration does not want to take on Iran. It's negotiating or trying to negotiate a nuclear agreement. And the president's letter to the supreme leader is indicative, it seems to me, of their skittishness about taking on Iran. The president said in the letter, as reported by the Wall Street Journal and has never been denied in any element, that the United States will not attack the Assad regime in its fight against Daesh. And between the lines of that assurance, there's a lot you can read. For example, why is the president even mentioning Syria in a letter to the supreme leader when it is not, so far as I know, it is not part of the Iranian state, nor is it in fact a place where Iran belongs historically or naturally or in terms of borders or anything else. Why is he even mentioning it? And is there a kind of an action? And this again, here's the parallel with Afghanistan, where the U.S. subcontracted its foreign policy in Afghanistan to Pakistan. And is there a kind of an element here in which the U.S. is now saying to the Iranians, well, you can take the lead. We're not going to challenge you or your guy. And here's the biggest irony of all: when the U.S. talks about teaming up with, or maybe cooperating with Iran, or maybe just simply operating on a parallel track with Iran in fighting Daesh. Think back. Who is advising the Assad regime? Who has got the hammerlock on the Assad regime as it decides not to take on Daesh? As it tolerated this past year the creation of a whole string of towns and bases in the north, and never attacked one of them. The black flag was flying over Raqqa for the longest time, and never attacked. They were operating out of the city hall and out of the governorate headquarters, and the regime never took them on. Now, clearly, if the Iranians wanted to take on Daesh, if they really felt that this was a mortal threat to them, and it's a mortal threat to, I think, nearly everybody in the region, then they might have advised their client to go after Daesh and fight them. And to this day, the latest bombing in Raqqa about 2 weeks ago, the New York Times had a very good story on it, was a case study of how the regime goes after Daesh. They bombed Raqqa, and they hit civilians, and they didn't hit Daesh. So this is the problem with the Iranian factor here. The administration doesn't want to take them on, but I think they have to make a fundamental decision if they want to go after Daesh. They have to decide how to deal with Iran.
Thank you. Okay, Oubai, I also want you to answer the Abdul Karim Ahmed question, and maybe you could address this last question about how to get a handle on sort of financing of the radical jihadist groups, what you hear about how that can be better controlled.
Well, first regarding the issue of Russia and Iran, it's really important just to address that, and to that I say, if you can't trust the Russians, who can you trust? These days. And in all seriousness, that was part. I was there in Geneva when we were negotiating with the Assad regime, and the Kremlin played a very duplicitous and malign role in those negotiations. The Russians like to take the position that they support a political solution without any preconditions, to include the fate of the Assad regime. The reality is that the Russians are much more committed than people realize to maintaining Assad in power and to maintaining the status quo. That's why they've actually redoubled their military supply efforts in conjunction with the Iranians to the Assad regime. So the Russians are playing a very, very malign role in Syria, despite the recent pronouncement by the Kremlin and by their deputy Foreign Minister Boganov on the importance of a political solution. For them, a political solution, and from the perspective of Moscow, is essentially the status quo ante, with maybe some mild, superficial changes to the facade of the Assad regime, but essentially maintaining the security services and maintaining the essence of the authoritarian regime in Damascus, which is a non-starter and which is completely in defiance of the Geneva communique that was agreed upon by the United Nations, that was technically agreed upon by the Assad regime, in addition to the opposition. Now, when it comes to the elephant in the room, it's Iran. And if the Assad regime, as we call it, as Washington, as the administration refers to it, as the primary magnet for terror in Syria today, then Iran is the turbo engine that is driving terrorism in Syria and in Iraq. It is not a viable partner for the United States or other international allies to work with in the fight against Daesh. If anything, I invite everyone to read a very extensive analysis and report by Martin Chulov in The Guardian that was just published yesterday that details specifically how the Assad regime's Syrian military intelligence worked very, very closely with the facilitation of the Islamic State of Iraq's operatives in Syria. This is the precursor to ISIS, the precursor to Daesh. And the Iranians have a very close and intimate relationship with these security and intelligence forces. And today, the Assad regime's military is essentially an auxiliary of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It is a component of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards network in the Levant, and it is a component of Lebanese Hezbollah's command and control structure. In Syria today, the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah are playing a leading role in driving the campaign in northern Syria and in Aleppo. The Assad regime's forces are essentially become now a component of that command and control structure. So yes, Iran is sort of the primary component here if you're looking for a solution in Syria, but it is also playing the main malign role in Syria, and not only driving the conflict, but ultimately in allowing establishing a conducive environment for Daesh and extremists to thrive. And it would be you would be pouring jet fuel on the fire of extremism in Syria and Iraq today if the United States were to publicly and officially partner with Iran in the fight against Daesh. That is a surefire way to lose the support of the local Sunni community that you need in the fight against Daesh and other extremist groups. With regards to the Supreme Military Council and efforts by the opposition to establish a coherent structure, a coherent military structure that the world can work with. Look, there's no question the opposition itself has to do its homework. There's a lot of work that the opposition has to do in order to present a credible and coherent force for the world to partner with. But they have made significant amount of advances in terms of enhancing their coherency and enhancing their organizational structure. A new Supreme Military Council has been formed. And at its leadership, you have defected former military officers who are very capable and who have a proven record, operational record on the ground. But at the end of the day, the existing, if they're like as Ambassador Ford mentioned, if you do not have a unified logistical support network, supported by the United States and by its regional allies, that ensures that the Supreme Military Council is empowered and has the necessary leverage to distribute resources to Free Syrian moderate forces on the ground that are left in northern and in southern Syria. You simply will not have a Supreme Military Council that exists in anything other than name. So there is a role for the United States to play. The opposition has done its part. They have jumped through the hoops. I think you have today a much more organized opposition than you have had before. But you also, as part of that effort, you also need American leadership to play an important facilitatory role with the regional Arab allies.
We're running out of time, and I would like General Eaton, who to maybe make a final comment or two, since there were no questions. Perhaps drawing off of what Oubai said, final comments about the need for unified logistical support network, phase 2, and our role.
First, I'd like to address at the Army War College, at all our war colleges, they start things off with countries have interests, they don't have friends. Most countries, and we subscribe to that rule, the United States, probably more clearly than many other countries. So appeals to our emotions don't necessarily draw action unless it goes directly to our interests. We have deviated from that a little bit. Our incursion into Somalia and Bosnia, Libya, were emotive reactions, but it's hard to get us off that particular dime. In the case of Russia, there are incentives and disincentives that could cause a key reaction out of Putin. His economy is based on oil at between $110 and $100 a barrel. Today, oil went below 60. And he's having a hard time with the ruble. He's having a hard time maintaining his position in the world. So there are incentives. If the United States and Saudi Arabia together were to reduce oil production by 5%, that would mean a terrific amount of money difference to the Russians and other people. So it's a Kissinger talked about linkage. There's a whole lot of linkage going on here, and that at the very strategic level, at the logistics level, the United States military, the United States Army in particular, that's what we do. Everybody can be a tactician and a strategist. Professionals are logisticians. So it just stunned me that we were as bad as we were at maintaining proper logistics support to the Iraqi armed forces while we were in Iraq and after we left. And what Oubai mentioned is that's doable for us. It's not hard, and there's money to do it. So I'm stunned that we're not doing it.
We just need to do it right. Yes, Robert, final thought.
Real quick to answer John's question. John, I think most of the Islamic State financing does not come from outside. It's smuggled oil, it's extortion, and the Iraqi finance minister today said publicly that they estimate that when the Islamic State seized Mosul and other towns in Iraq, and of course took the money in the banks, they got at least $500 million. So now that's the Iraqi finance minister, Hoshar Zebari. So my sense is John, for sure there's some money trickling in from outside. I don't think it's from foreign governments. I think it's mainly from charitable organizations who may or may not know what their money is being used for. But it's a problem. But I think the bigger problem is that the Islamic State is largely self-financed. Now, oil prices being a world price, they'll probably suffer a bit too. Black market prices for their low-grade product out of Syria will drop as well. That's good. But I don't think that this is something where we can go to regional allies and make a convincing argument and they can turn off a switch and suddenly the Islamic State is out of money. I think most of the money they generate inside.
Thank you. Well, I'm afraid our time is up. I'm sure you share my views that this has been a very insightful panel, and we look forward to more discussions about the Syrian rebel forces in 2015. Thank you all very much.